Adam, it's a pleasure to get you back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be back. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. There's been a lot going on. I think there is the very pressing topic right now of this whole infrastructure bill. And I guess put it into context, right? America's population is, I don't know, 330, 350 million out of a population of 8 billion. But it does still impact what happens on the rest of the world, given obviously America's place in the world, wealth, and all of these things. And I also noticed there is this interesting parallel with what was going on back in the 90s in the crypto wars. So I'm wondering, do you see any parallels to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess America is a big market, and I can't pretend to understand, American and Australian politics. It's hard enough to understand local politics at times. It seems like a messy process. I think mostly what we'd like them to do is to, not mess it up, not create silly, illogical rules that create a mess. So of course everybody has opinions on it. And some people have a view that, well, you know, um, just focus on technology. It doesn't matter what they do and stuff like that. So I think there's, at the fundamentals, that's true. But at the same time, you don't want them to create a mess because it will be, time consuming for people to deal with, or create a funny environment where some countries or some provinces within some countries are no-go zones where nobody wants to provide business services, and that happens in New York with the bit license. So it'd be a shame if they did something like that, or you know, create something disorganized that doesn't really make sense, and that presumably has to get worked out later in less tidy
Yeah.
ways. So I think that's why what Coin Center has been saying makes sense. I like the fact that one senator put forward a bill, which was what I was saying. Like, why do you even need this? Can't you just delete it? And he put forward an amendment to do that. So I was like, good, that's the right answer. But the the experts in U.S. political lobbying at Coin Center uh, think that won't work. Like that won't pass. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, the whole thing, really, to be honest. But
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And just context for listeners. So there is a current infrastructure bill draft, and it has wording in the tax code defining brokers to include, quote unquote, any person who, for consideration, is responsible for regularly providing any service effectuating transfers of digital assets on behalf of another person, end quote. Now, that could be seen as overly broad, and maybe it captures in people who are not actually brokers. And so I think one of the pushbacks we're seeing, or at least some of the commentary we're seeing, is, oh, see, you Bitcoin people, you don't want to pay your taxes and whatever. But really, it's not just, even if you set aside the tax part, it's capturing people as brokers when really they are not brokers. And so that's what some of this amendment is about, and really we're trying to make it feasible for people to still operate in the Bitcoin world, whether that means they are running a Lightning node, or whether they are a Bitcoin developer, or whether they are, let's say, operating a multi-signature service like Unchained Capital, or even like Blockstream Green.
right.
And I think you have commented in the past that maybe your view is a little more like, let's try to keep innovating the technology, and not focus as much on the politics. But I guess that's also seen reflected in some of the Bitcoin community, where some of them are saying, "Oh, screw them! Bitcoin is meant to be all about self censorship, sovereignty anyway."
Right.
So how do you sort of balance that?
Well, I mean,
Uh,
I'm on the right code, not laws. Don't vote. It encourages them, kind of end of the spectrum. But I am practical, so I'm pleased that there are competent people lobbying for common sense in their circles, and they do have some influence. Of course, it's all a bit chaotic and random what actually happens, so that's a bit disappointing for something of value to an economy. That what actually comes through is down to sort of random last minute haggling by some politicians who there are some politicians who actually do understand and own Bitcoin, which is nice to see, but there are many who don't, who are lobbying, who don't even understand what they're lobbying for, and that is not a good recipe in general.
of course, and if we were to see, the worst of it happen, that this amendment passes through, or sorry, that the this bill passes through without some kind of amendment to give a carve out for certain Bitcoin companies, what's your view on where companies might go? Would they restructure, or would they perhaps go offshore to some other countries in the world to set up their services?
They might. I mean, there's certainly, the US is a more complicated zone to provide services. And I mean, Blockstream is a Canadian company with, operations in other countries as well. And so many of the market operational entities like exchanges and derivatives platforms and so on are not in the US, and many of them won't provide service to US residents, for example. So this is already a factor. So, and the number of some of the more advanced market services like leveraged options and leveraged trading, um, some of the crypto lending markets are hard for US residents to get to, for this reason. So they're sort of disadvantaged, and I guess ultimately that sort of impacts the American economy a little.
Yeah. And another angle is also the mining aspect. So I believe even the quote unquote bad amendment here does have a carve out for proof of work mining, but I have seen some of the commentary from some of the politicians saying, oh, look how much energy proof of work is using. Obviously, I know you'll have something to say about that also. So do you have any views on what that impact might be? Or could we potentially see an ESG style attack and say, oh, look, see, we should use proof of stake because it doesn't use as much quote again quotes it doesn't waste as much energy as the quote unquote wasteful proof of work. What would you say? Do you see a risk there?
I mean, politics and any complicated, nuanced topic don't typically mix very well, and so there is certainly, some potential to create some logistical problems to clear up. But I mean, actually, in terms of energy use, there are lots of arguments to be had. I think that, um, for example, we have an operation in the US and an operation in Canada, in the Quebec province of Canada, and the Quebec province of Canada has the electrical grid is 99% renewable. It's like 95% hydro, 4% wind, and 1%, I guess other sources that are able to be spun up and down very quickly, which is probably gas or something like that. And so it's like as green as it comes, effectively, and it's 50% unused, and it's very hard to get access to it. And that was down to politics. There was an election year. A lot of things got confused. There was a moratorium on power for mining, and that province of Canada has more than enough unused hydropower to power the entire Bitcoin network today, even today, years later, right? So, to say that governments and politicians have concerns about ESG, well, there's a solution right there. Stop, blocking access to green power, and it's not costless because, if you don't use power from a hydro dam, you just open the sluice gates and pour the water downstream, and it heats up the environment at the bottom of the dam. And no, it's a zero difference to the environment, and it basically foregoes billions of dollars of net revenue to this power grid owner, which is a government-owned corporation. And so it loses money for the province, and of course business flows around restrictions, right? It's like the internet routes around damage. Bitcoin mining is extremely survivable and will go wherever it needs to go. And so, we certainly started expanding more in the US in reaction to that, but there are many other countries. So actually, I mean, China is another one. So some people sort of speciously commented that, well, the Chinese government reduced the, carbon footprint of Bitcoin mining by, pushing a number of miners, making it difficult for miners to operate in China. And so they relocated, or some are in the process of relocating. Hash rate's still down. But actually, China is a good example of a country with enormous amounts of unused hydro. So particularly, it depends on the season, like rainy season versus not. They also have coal in other places, so there's some truth to that. But there's certainly a lot more unused hydro capacity in China now. So that that's a mixed result, I would say. And is people say that that's good for decentralization, but I think you want actually a balance of mining in lots of different countries. So some mining in China is actually good because it balances out you know the biases of other countries. So you don't have to agree with a particular country's policies. You just want lots of countries that may or may not agree. So there's a diversity.
Right. And I think the other angle that could come in the future is even hypothetical. Now, of course, I believe we can make that argument and say, hey, look how much people are using renewable. Well, like you can make that argument. But I wonder in the future, there might be some ESG people who say, even if it was 100% renewable, it's still not good. And they might say, that's why we should use proof of stake or some other mechanism. And of course, I guess the Bitcoiner answer to that would be something like, look, proof of work is actually how we achieve a decentralized consensus and make this an actual money that is not politically controlled. So that's the whole point. So how
Right.
would you explain that, or how would you come
Yeah.
back to that sort of argument?
I mean, I think that's true. And, you know, I'm very skeptical that proof of stake actually works at the end of the day. And even if it does work, it's, even if it somehow magically was made to work, it's, I would say it's undesirable, like, because it has, the same factors that go into um, political money, government money, which is, there are people that have printed the money who are then going to hand it out, and you have the Cantillon effect, and people who are, have close ties with the committees that are in control of these things get cheaper money or get free money or get money for being promoters. And then you get kind of special interests that can get favors. Like if they lose money, they can undo it. If other lose people who are less influential or have less contacts, they can't. And so there's basically like fiat, but instead of being run by, you know, world-class monetary economists, run by some JavaScript developers, basically, with no prior economic training. And I'm not sure that's better, actually, at the end of the day. So I think proof of stake is basically, a disguised centralized federation, almost worse than a federation because you can buy seats, right? You buy stake and you can get influence. So it's kind of prone to takeover, and like all of these things have been observed in the wild. I think altcoins are kind of great for brute forcing all possible failure modes, often with warnings of, "Oh, don't do that; it will fail," and then they do it and it fails. But they've certainly proven empirically many things actually do fail in the way that people predict they will. So I think it's another one of those. Another argument about that with proof of work, I think it's kind of like gold mining, right? So there's a quite old Satoshi quote from Bitcoin Talk or somewhere that um, you know the world is a better place for having gold as a dependable apolitical money than without the expenditure to mine it. And another thing is that in particular case of Bitcoin, it teaches people about saving and long-term thinking and about money and about Austrian economics. And so many people who would have previously been prone to spend all of their disposable income on gadgets and stuff um, become avid savers because they realize that if you can save your money in something that has more than doubled every year for 10 years, that could be very economically interesting if it were to continue. And so they will stop spending. And so people think about money in a wrong way. They think that, it comes from nowhere, but there's always a foregone alternative in any expenditure, right? So the people that bought Bitcoin or mined Bitcoin, they gave up some other form of economic activity to do that. So they didn't, given the average Western person's spending habits, which includes very little saving, I must say, it involves a lot of, uh, credit card debt and consumer goods. So many of the consumer goods are basically made of plastic. They end up in a landfill within a few years. And that's the alternative, right? So you're saying, oh, Bitcoin mining. Well, Bitcoin mining is significantly done with renewable energy because it's the cheapest. And even if it were not, it's still probably a net benefit for the environment because all those, there's far less things that end up in landfills as a result of Bitcoin savers that would have been buying these things. So I think that's interesting. And I think, the long term thinking is generally a good thing for, you know, for many reasons, but including, kind of valuing the state of the planet for future generations. I mean, people are saving, they start to think about, what happens. What happens to their money? What happens to their descendants? Things like that. Which people who are trapped in a kind of um, consumer rat race, they're focused on, next week or next month, right? Or what they can
Of
spend
course.
next.
Absolutely. And there's so many social and cultural impacts of fiat money. And as you rightly point out, we have to compare monetary standards overall. So what is the cost of a gold standard versus a fiat standard versus a Bitcoin standard? And we have to look at that holistically. And I think people who only look narrowly at, the energy, they don't understand. And so that's why I think we could argue, even if Bitcoin was 100% fossil fuel mined, it would still be well worth it. And that's probably part of how we have to explain it to some people. But
Right.
for others, of course, we can explain to them, oh, look, lots of renewable energy is
Well,
being used.
right. I mean, I think another point which, so I have my doubts whether proof of stake actually works. Like functionally, typically they degrade into kind of very inefficient, complicated proof of work. But and the other disadvantages we talked about. But Paul Stortz is a kind of has a background in academic game theory. Um, has has some interesting comments about it, which is that, if you have a way to obtain money, logically people will be prepared to spend up to the value of the money to obtain it. So, if a Bitcoin is worth $40,000, ultimately, including all of their costs and their projections, they'll be willing to spend up to $40,000 per coin mining it. Now, today, cost of mining a coin is probably below 5,000. It's very profitable for various reasons in this period. But that's generally true for commodity economics, right? And so that being the case, a proof of stake system doesn't save any money. It just means that energy, that incentive flows elsewhere. So in the same way that political monies or the petrodollar does, right? So it leads to wars, it leads to lobbying, leads to bribery, it leads to favoritism, uh, accounting costs for reconciliation, legal disputes. So basically, the same amount of money is spent because it's chasing the same incentive, right? And it's just spent in like um, untidy, inefficient ways, which waste human, resources essentially. Um, so I think that's another reason. Like Bitcoin is extremely clean and tidy, and provides a kind of mathematical avenue for people to expend their demand in. So that has a very predictable and tidy market. Whether the other market is all full of um, insider advantage and lobbying and fraud of different kinds and so on. So that's not a good backdrop for economic growth. I think for economic growth, you want clean, dependable markets, and Bitcoin does a much better job of giving that. So I think that of course, the Bitcoin standard is a much more lofty thing than Bitcoin competing with physical gold, for example, or gold ETFs. But it does make a lot of sense to see the world migrate back to a digital gold standard, resuming the gold standard, as opposed to this, on the arc of history, very short-term experiment with easy credit and money, fiat money printing.
Well stated. And so when we're talking about Bitcoin mining, and as you said, this idea of predictability, and if mining flows out of the USA, even, I mean, it's weird because it seems like a lot of the mining is coming into the USA, but let's say if there's also other areas where people are going to mine or even El Salvador, right? The idea of volcano mining or geothermal mining. Do you have any thoughts on that whole idea, geothermal mining? Do you see that that might become more prominent, or do you think it's going to be more like the hydro is going to be the way?
I mean, there is significant geothermal mining, and actually, Iceland is another country that has volcanoes. So volcano mining, if you like, it's a fantastic meme. So of course, it really took on. But there is, there's significant amounts of that going on in Iceland, and I think the trade-off with geothermal is the infrastructure is relatively costly per megawatt to set up. But with the right cost base and expertise and funding, like a government infrastructure bond, something like that could be possible. So we're certainly interested to explore that, and that's something that we're working on in the background.
Great. And while we're on this topic of mining, I think another angle, and as we're harkening back to this idea of the crypto wars and potential censorship in the future. So, of course, this is not a thing right now, but I wonder, is that a potential in the future where, let's say, a lot of the big miners are publicly listed entities, they are regulated by the government, and potentially at that point, could the government try to levy some kind of whitelisting or blacklisting approach to censor where the transactions go? And then at that point, then it's going to be, well, there's a few sort of defenses in the ecosystem. One of those could be the use of privacy techniques so that the miners don't know which
Right.
party is who, because it's a pseudonymous ledger. You don't know who is who. But I guess it kind of it depends on how many people are coming in through, say, the KYC on ramp versus people who are, let's say, earning or mining or buying non KYC, just as an example. But do you see that as a possibility, or do you see that like it's just not going to be feasible given the decentralization?
I mean, a decentralization definitely helps against that issue, and there was one corporate miner that was talking in these terms, but they have since had new management and dropped that idea. So that's good to see. I think you need sufficient decentralization. I think another thing that helps is because there are different sort of vectors for centralization. One is the mining pools, and the other one is the physical mining, the miners and a mining farm. Um, and so there's actually more centralization in mining pools than in mining farms. I mean, of course, the total hash rate is quite big, so decentralization might be tens of megawatts in a warehouse or something, right? But nevertheless, they're in different countries, and mining itself is in principle anonymous, right? So unlike transactions, there's no history to a mined coin, and there's no, and it's necessarily that way so that miners can join and leave the network, and so the network's survivable. So, but I mean, I do think that Bitcoin's privacy and fungibility would it'd be great to see that be improved. So I think that helps. I mean, for mining in particularly, it's probably the most private part of Bitcoin protocol because there's no coin history. So in a sense, if you have reasonable cost of power and you can mine some Bitcoins, in a garage or a small warehouse or something, those are actually very private coins in a way, right? So, but the other parts of Bitcoin where you have transaction history, I think it would be great to see technology become deployable into Bitcoin. So, I've been very interested in that area, and we deployed a few things related to that in Liquid, Bitcoin sidechain. So, particularly confidential transactions, I think is an interesting kind of hybrid, which provides some aspects of privacy, but is very compatible with the existing model. And people tend to like incremental changes, and there are probably some things you can build on top of it once you have it, but it definitely helps a bit in this way.
Yeah, yeah. And so you were touching there on the idea of home miners or garage band miners, and this idea that maybe they're not necessarily doing it wholly for commercial reasons, but partly for ideological support the network reasons, or also because they want to earn non-KYC sats, as all of us would like to earn more sats, of course. And so it seems like over the industry in the earlier years, it was, well, maybe I'm colored by the time I came in, but everyone was saying, oh, don't mine it. You got to be putting in lots of money. And now it seems like there's a bit of a resurgence in the idea of home mining, even if you are potentially not fully profitable on that, but you're just paying a little bit of a premium to get non KYC. And I think even right now, many miners are profitable even on their home rates. So I
Right.
wonder, do you see that being an angle that more and more people, we see lots and lots of home miners, or more, let's say the people who do like the mining in like a container and they drag it around and plug it in, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, because of the economic situation with mining profitability right now, it's you can technically make money at some ridiculously high energy rates. Now that may not persist for too many years, but at the moment there's a bit of a shortage of miners, and I guess eventually there may be next a shortage of power infrastructure because people don't they build just in time, and there's only so much. There's lots of reasonable cost hydropower in the Quebec province, as we're just saying, but it's difficult to get. I mean, you could certainly do a modest scale in a home environment or something, but if you try to do it as a business, that's difficult in that province. But certainly other places that would work. Um, so it's a good time. I mean, of course, the miners are a bit hard to get, but there's more availability since the China um, ban, I guess. Finally, they've been talking about banning Bitcoin in various regards for many years until people became a bit of a running joke, and they never really banned it. But finally, they have actually done something with to discourage mining in China. So yeah, that freed up some capacity for certainly used miners if you want to take that risk, or new miners became less oversubscribed.
Yeah, yeah. And as more people might do it ideologically, then that might also help the censorship resistance aspect. Because let's say all the regulated miners have to, potentially in the future, this is a hypothetical, they might say, oh, you need to whitelist or blacklist addresses. Well, then the transactors who want to be more self-sovereign and private might be attaching a little higher fee to their transactions, and then the ideological garage band miners might be the ones who are picking those transactions up and ensuring they still get mined into a block.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I proposed another protocol. This is back in 2013 to potentially solve this problem, which is that you basically, when you mine, you don't see the addresses that are being transacted. They become visible later, and maybe a day later, but they can actually persist in that state for long term. It's called committed transactions or encrypted transactions. And so the idea is that you sort of process like a hash of the transaction, and at a later point you reveal the keys. And at that point, it's difficult for the miners to undo it because they'd have to undo their own, like they'd have to redo and compete against their own previous work. So it changes the economics of uh, applying policy to mine transactions. And you don't want like policy coming in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it loses the transparency after they're processed. It just kind of prevents addresses being used as a policy during the mining process, effectively. So
Yeah,
that's something that could be worked on. I think that could be interesting as well.
yeah, yeah. And
I mean,
also, you also
there's
mentioned, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say the other thing that can help is um, with, as I said, there's a lot like more centralization with mining pools, and there are some new pool protocols which enable the miner. So today a miner is just asking a pool, like, give me a string to mine on. So they don't even know what transactions are in it, right? So the pools are the only people that really see the transactions until the blocks are produced. And so with these new protocols, it's possible for the miner, even a small miner, to construct their own block, and still benefit from a pool reduction in variance. And so, those protocols being worked on by a number of different people. We did some of the early work on it under the name OpenHash, and it's been talked about as BetterHash and Stratum v2. It's all the same kind of basic idea. So I think that's a good direction too, because as a miner, you want, not just to mine, but you want to have control of which transactions are mined, so that you can apply whichever ones are more profitable policy to that, right?
Yeah, so hopefully with Stratum v2, that might help in some ways there around the relation between a pool and the miner. And yeah, so you're also touching on this idea of confidential transactions. And so that seems like, at least my understanding of it, is that the Bitcoin community at large, Bitcoin users, at this stage, it doesn't look like they would support this in Bitcoin today. But I'm curious your thoughts on the hopes for it to someday come to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, to my perspective, it needs to be. I mean, there are two versions of it, and one has perfect privacy, but in a very distant future, like a quantum supercomputer or something. Um, if you've got the perfect privacy variant, then you have a risk of coin inflation, and of course, in a Bitcoin context, people really hate that, because the 21 million cap is what it's all about, right? And they don't want a risk, even a very remote future risk, to be considered. So we use that perfect privacy variant in Liquid, but Liquid is more for kind of short-term transacting and trading. So we think that's a reasonable trade-off there. But there's another version which would, I think, be better for Bitcoin, which is it doesn't have that risk. Like it's mathematically, it won't work. To if somebody attacks it in the future, they'll strip the privacy, but they won't be able to create coins. And so that's probably the failure mode that is more attractive to Bitcoin, because it just falls back to the status quo if that technology erodes over time. And I think that technology is good for decades, to be clear. So it's really a kind of remote, far future, hypothetical kind of issue. And those transactions are also not that compact. So that's another concern, right? So I think that you would want that kind of the one without inflation, like mathematically provably no inflation, and to find a way to make them more compact. So the techniques to make confidential transactions smaller happen not to work for that type. They work for the
Yep.
type that has inflation risk. And so we've used some of those things in Liquid. Like we're looking to move to bulletproofs, but bulletproofs lose that property.
I see. Yeah. So just summarizing from my understanding, correct me if I'm getting this wrong. So the method that would help us have privacy, but with some inflation risk, that's using Pedersen commitments. And then the technique that can be used to make those transactions smaller is bulletproofs. And so that's what we're looking to use in Liquid, as you're saying,
Right.
but potentially not the right trade off for Bitcoin. And then the other side is we definitely know 100% there's not going to be any inflation beyond 21 million. But the trade-off is the transaction sizes will be higher, and so therefore scalability could be more of an issue. And that's using, I believe, El-Gamal commitments, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Right. So that's the trade-off. So, but I mean, there remains hope. At least I think it's theoretically possible that one could find a more compact way to do El-Gamal commitments. So that like a breakthrough in that could move this kind of project forward. And of course,
Yeah.
it's an area of like very active research. Like there's a lot of interest in bulletproof and bulletproof-like things. So it's quite plausible that some more breakthroughs can happen.
Yeah, so potentially then, if we were to do this El-Gamal way that doesn't have any inflation risk, I guess there might maybe there'd be some people in the community who might still be concerned that okay, maybe there is some implementation risk, and therefore there could be some problem there. So
Right.
maybe that could also be an issue for them in their minds of why
Right.
they wouldn't. Yeah.
I mean, I think that sort of fear of the unfamiliar, in a sense that, because the result is sort of counterintuitive and amazing, right? Well, you can you can hide the amounts and you can mathematically prove that they add up. Like, how is that even possible, right? Zero knowledge proofs are kind of novel things, and this is a novel use of them. But if you get down into how it works, and Waxwing has a PDF explainer where he basically taught himself it. He went read the papers and reconstructed it and wrote some Python code and gave some examples and explainer of how it all works. It's basically the same technology as the ECDSA signatures, or the Schnorr signatures particularly, and it's just basically a ring signature saying this bit of the number is a 0 or a 1, and you don't know which. And it just applies that multiple times, plus a bunch of optimizations. So ultimately, if you dig into it a bit further, it's not that hard to understand. It's using the same technology that Bitcoin already relies on, and it's very old technology. It's been around for decades, so it doesn't have the kind of bleeding edge risk that comes with some of the other snark type things, where things actually have gone wrong in the field, or or those things can be so complicated that there are very few people who really understand them. I think one of the things that went wrong was, the implementation was correct, but the paper was wrong, and nobody had noticed, and it's an academic paper. So these there is a reason to be scared of complexity, but actually, LGML commitments are. I mean, of course, not everybody understands them, but not everybody understands, ECDSA and why that works either, right? So there has to be some kind of, if we restrict ourselves too much, we give up some opportunity, and maybe irrationally so. And I'd argue this is the case. Now, of course, that's a discussion that you know would be a fun discussion to have. It's a much more interesting discussion than a block size discussion, right? That
Of
do
course,
we
yeah.
want some more fungibility? Obviously, another area people would argue about is like, it's more private, and maybe that reduces the chances of an ETF, or something like that, right? Like, there may be regulators won't like it and so on. But actually, when we first introduced confidential transactions into Liquid, it seemed like everybody liked it, including people from a banking background, because they thought that the full transparency was too much. It was not
I
good
see.
for
Yeah,
commercial activity.
yeah,
And you still got the audit. Plus, I think the other thing is incremental, so it doesn't actually erase the transaction history. You can still see the inputs and the outputs. You just don't know how much was
yeah,
transacted. So I think that's an argument. That's a convenient argument that it's actually fairly incremental on how things work today. Right? It's still, there's still inputs and outputs. You can see which coins went from which addresses to which addresses. You just can't see how many coins were involved.
yeah,
And it's a reasonable thing to say that, well, why should you know how many coins are involved? That's bad for safety and security, and you can't see that with somebody's bank account. So why should you see it with Bitcoin?
of course, yeah. And so, from a scalability point of view, I'm not sure if you've looked at the numbers recently, but what kind of impact would it have in terms of how much bigger would the transactions be? So let's say right now a Bitcoin block might have 2,000, 3,000 transactions in it, like on average. What kind of numbers would we be talking about if we were to move into an LGAML confidential transactions world?
I mean, I'd say they are, I don't know, maybe about 5 times bigger. So actually physically, 20 times bigger, approximately 15, 20 times bigger. But the Liquid is organized like Bitcoin, so it has SegWit, and the confidential transactions range proofs go in the witness, so they get the discount. So in terms of the weight of a transaction, it might be 4 times bigger. In terms of the size, it might be closer to, 5 times bigger. In terms of the size, it might be closer to 20 times, 15 to 20 times. So something like that, maybe 5 times. And, so hopefully that could be optimized, and that kind of, so there's less overhead. I think in terms of the argument for why that might be a good thing to do anyway, even if you couldn't optimize it as much as you'd like, is that it's a more powerful transaction, so it could replace multiple non-confidential transactions for some uses, and you see this, right? So when people are doing coin joins, they split their coins up into units like 0.01 or 0.001. And with confidential transactions, you don't need to do that, right? You can just join anything with anything, and it doesn't matter because nobody knows what the values are anyway. You just need to know that you've got out as much as you put in. And I've certainly seen people, company level or individual level, storing coins in chunks. So they'll make a wallet and they'll split it. They'll take how much money they have and they'll split it into 20 or 50 or something, and then they'll make change with it. And so they've got hundreds of outputs, maybe to obscure how much, how big their wallet is if they spend from it or something like that. I think it's generally a good idea to not put all your eggs in one basket, because if something very low probability happens, that'll be bad. So, people sometimes do, a small test transaction first. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. I think you do want some outputs, but you do get some back because they're more powerful transactions. So that's the argument.
Yeah. So in that world, let's say we did, move into that. Would it be possible then that some transactions would just be standard and then others would be El-Gamal style, or do you think it would be like an all or nothing thing here?
Well, they are compatible. So Liquid, the confidential and non-confidential can interoperate, and basically the math works out. So you can say, well, because what you want is the rule in the Bitcoin world is that the inputs have to add up to the outputs plus the fees. And it's still true with confidential transactions. The inputs, you don't know what they are, have to add up to the outputs plus the fee, and you see the fee, but you can mix in some confidential and non-confidential, and the math still works out. So they can interoperate. Now, of course, privacy likes company, so it's better if more people use it. And one argument, I mean, Greg Maxwell and I were talking about this because he was the person who did sort of the optimization and improvement of confidential transactions when it actually came to being implemented. And he made the argument that maybe in a Bitcoin setting, you'd want to have the same fees for confidential and not confidential so that people are not deterred from using it on a cost basis. So, I mean, you'd have to work out the details of how to do that, but, let's say there's a bigger discount for the range proofs than signatures, and that fee is the same whether you use it or not, hypothetically, right? And then that could take away the economic argument. And certainly Liquid, basically everything is confidential because it's kind of default in the wallets, and I mean, some of the wallets won't even send to a non-confidential transaction, to a non-confidential address, and others will. So it's a good default to say confidential everywhere.
Yeah, I see. And there's nothing stopping us from also comboing that and using El-Gamal, El-Gamal confidential transactions and comboing that with Lightning, say, so we still can transact.
Yeah, I mean, actually, so with so Blockstream is one of the multiple implementations of Lightning. So we have C Lightning, and that is able to make Lightning channels using Liquid Bitcoin. So Lightning. I mean, a lot of people don't know it, but Lightning is actually a kind of caching layer that can work above Bitcoin and sidechains of Bitcoin, and so it can, you can have different channels with different assets. Liquid Bitcoin being approximately Bitcoin, but you could also have a channel which is, let's say, Tether on a Liquid network, which might be interesting to some people. And so we've had that working for a couple of years now. There are still some things to do. So we don't yet have confidential amount support. So the Lightning channels have to be non-confidential. So we want to fix that, obviously. And we see how to do it. Like it's something that can be done. It just requires additional work because in Lightning today, you can ask how much capacity is in the channel, and you can check that. So it probably needs to, make a range proof in response to say, well, you don't need to know, but I can prove that there's at least this much, so you can send that.
Yeah, right. Because of probing and so on. Because they might,
Yeah, yeah,
as an example, a Lightning wallet might want to probe the pathways to sort of see, is there enough liquidity in the channels for me to be able to make this payment successfully or not, and therefore I can route it differently. And so,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, like if you do it too simplistically, probably somebody could remove the confidentiality by just probing all the capacity everywhere, at least for the publicly reachable channels. And then the CT is, you have CT, but it's not really meaningful because anybody that wants to can figure out what the capacities are. So um, you know, you could prove, you could lie. You could say, well, I have, a tenth of a Bitcoin, and really you have 2/10, right? And that's enough because you can prove that, and that sort of obscures the actual capacity of it.
yeah, yeah. And I guess another practical implication, if we were to have confidential transactions in Bitcoin, it helps break. So, from a chain analysis and chain surveillance perspective, listeners, you can check out the recent episode with Ergo where we talk about some of that. But essentially, it would break the round number heuristic, and it would help stop perhaps some change detection by an outside analyst, right? Because an analyst
Right.
is looking the inputs and the outputs, and they're trying to figure out which one's the payment, which one's the change. And so, in a confidential transactions world, that's a lot harder. So it's not that CoinJoin would disappear. It's that we might do it a different way, or we might have one global kind of CoinJoin liquidity pool as opposed to having like different pools for different sizes.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'd have some kind of batch spend, some kind of blinded batch spend mechanism. That way we can all transact privately in that model. Is that how you're seeing it?
Yeah. I mean, actually, there are a number of things. So, as you said, you don't have to. You can join any value, so you get kind of perfect join out of any value without matching sizes. So you get a non-empty set, a bigger non-empty set. So that's good. It's simpler because you don't have to make the logic, and it's harder to analyze because you can't guess at what is change from the amount. There's some other things like when we released confidential transactions, something that came out of that is the Mimblewimble protocol. So, it wasn't us, or at least I don't think it was anybody at Blockstream, but it's some kind of pseudonymous author, right, that wrote the original paper, and it uses um, the range proof. It's basically confidential transactions, and coincidentally, before that, I had noticed, discussing with Greg when he was implementing it, that you could, when you're sending a transaction, you've got to prove two things with confidential transaction. One is you've got to sign with the address that controls it, and the other one is you've got to prove that it adds up. And so there's a key that you use to prove that it adds up that only a blinding factor. So I said to Greg, you could probably make it anyone can spend, like drop the address and just prove ownership because you're the only person that can prove how many coins that is without disclosing it. The fact that you can prove it proves you own it, kind of thing. So if he was like, well, that's true, but let's just keep it, orthogonal, tidy, and the same as Bitcoin. But if he'd have gone down that path, I think he would have, found at least part of the Mimblewimble approach. So Mimblewimble just does that, and but of course it removes. I mean, everything becomes standardized, so you lose scripting with Mimblewimble. So that's not as cool. Scripting is nice. But in Liquid, we made some changes to account for it, so that there's a possibility for somebody to make a kind of Mimblewimble like wallet that doesn't have addresses, like everything's anyone can spend, and the range proofs are done, and so you could potentially remove history as a result of that. Now, I'm not convinced personally that Mimblewimble is that great for privacy because anybody who's trying to analyze it will record the history as it flows past, and so the fact that you don't need the history to catch up doesn't really give you privacy versus somebody that's recording, transactions as they're sent and processed, right? But anyway, I just thought I'd mention it because it's related to the privacy aspect. And another thing you can do is kind of something like what Monero does, but in a more scalable way, or Bitcoin, I think was what came first, um, with their ring signature. So instead of a ring signature, you can, which results in ever growing UTXO set, basically. So with confidential transactions, you can just basically send people dust. So, I can collect some addresses from somewhere, or some wallets can have a peer-to-peer protocol to, advertise addresses they would accept money on preemptively. And, I can just send dozens of people a Satoshi, and they can choose to claim it. And from the outside, you don't know, was that a real payment or was that dust? And it doesn't result in UTXO growth because you spend them. Like you have in Bitcoin, dust is actually used, abused for tracing, right? If you look through an old wallet, you will see these like specific odd, like I guess their minimum fee rate,
Yeah.
dust, and they're just trying to they tag a bunch of coins and see which ones get spent at the same time, and then say, aha, that's the same person. And so with CC, that actually becomes a feature, which is you can just send people dust and they can just say thank you and spend it, right? And that gives you privacy, actually, unlike in a Bitcoin case.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect because then the outside observer is going to really struggle to understand what's going on because part of how these companies do it now is that they're really trying to assess what are the flows on the chain, as it were, on the transaction graph, as it were. But this idea of confidential transaction dust might really gum up the works there and stop their ability to do that.
Yeah,
But I wonder then it might also become like it also comes into the scalability conversation because obviously if it costs a lot more in terms of bytes or it costs a lot more in terms of fees, then it might be a difficult part there. But I guess we're hoping that future technological growth comes or something comes that makes it a little bit more
right.
amenable or palatable for the broader
Well,
Bitcoin audience.
right. I mean, there might be. I mean, it would be a different controversial discussion, but there might be an argument to say, um, maybe there's consensus for a block size increase if you can get confidential transactions at the same time. And I think technically, the range proofs are not as critical to keep forever because, in Bitcoin, you don't verify signatures beyond a certain depth. I mean,
Yeah,
you can opt to override it, but by default, you don't check them more than, you know,
from
a
block
year
one.
or
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
right back. And the same could be said for the range proofs because, you know, people wouldn't, miners and full nodes wouldn't have followed the chain this far if there was, if the range proofs were broken or if the signatures were invalid. And so beyond a certain amount of work, people just assume, or the clients just assume, well, that must be correct or it wouldn't have got here. But there remains a possibility to verify it back to the beginning. So that could be applied to the range proofs as well.
yeah. So I guess it also comes into how accessible Bitcoin is because the typical conversation is, oh, it should be accessible for everyone.
Yeah,
The retail individual should be able to run it on community hardware. That kind of conversation,
yeah.
and yeah, how much hard
Well,
drive
it's
space. Yeah,
definitely a concern, and you see it with Liquid. Like, it's got a different balance because each range proof is like dozens, equivalent of dozens of signatures, and so the Liquid blockchain is not full because it's still growing and seeing adoption of different new wallets and swap services and market, liquidity pool market makers and things coming into it. But um, it does make your CPU run hot. So I think you know it has potential to be at capacity to be maybe 10 or 15 times bigger history per day and require a bigger CPU, right? So um, if that gets some years of full capacity use under it, you might be talking about, you know, a good a good DSL connection, not an average one, and a desktop class CPU, not a Raspberry Pi 4, for example. And for Liquid, that's an okay trade-off because it's an opt-in sidechain for a use case, and it's not as good. I mean, Liquid has got trade-offs. It's not as good for ultimate censorship resistance and things like that, right? So I think it's okay for there to make a different trade-off, but to do that on the main chain on Bitcoin, that's a more difficult discussion. So really, I mean, of course, computers get faster over time and bandwidth increases, but not that much. And history is growing too. So it's still a tricky trade-off. So ideally, there's some more optimization. I think is the best answer.
Yeah, and it also, some of what we've been talking about plays into this idea of Bitcoin as censorship-resistant money. And I know you guys at Blockstream are doing a lot to help with that, even with BlockSat satellite, so people can uh, download the blockchain over a satellite from a dish. And I know you've got a new product out. It's called was it Base, right?
Yeah, the base station. Yeah, so that is. I mean, actually, with that, we introduced. We didn't used to have full history. We used to only have like a couple of weeks of kind of rotating history. So we increased the bandwidth. We did a lot of custom compression, so like to make everything smaller. And then we were able to get a full history sync in a week or two. So in some areas, there are two satellites that you can reach, and they're broadcasting different error correction streams. So if you've got two dishes pointing at two satellites, you can sync twice as fast, basically. So that gets you down to 1 week. Otherwise, it's 2 weeks. And so we're pretty excited about that tech. And the base station is a newer kind of satellite dish technology. So the elliptical dishes are analog, um, and these new dishes are kind of phased array. They're rectangular, and there's digital tech in the dish. There's a Ethernet. It's powered by power over Ethernet, not a coax. It's it's a phased array, so it's a little bit less sensitive to pointing errors, and it's a bit more compact and elegant. And it has hardware accelerated decoding actually in a dish. So we have hardware accelerated decoding for the elliptical dishes, but it's a separate kind of, looks like a DSL modem, some kind of little box you plug in, and that has to be in the house with the analog. So you'll plug the coax into it, and you plug an Ethernet into it or a Wi-Fi, and then you can broadcast Bitcoin transactions for your local network or over Wi-Fi. But there's just less moving parts and easier to assemble with the base station, because you basically, you point it, connect it up outside. It's all powered over a single cable, which is power over Ethernet, and then you've got the power and the data coming in over one line. And there's less things to plug together, less things to plug into the wall, less cabling, less configuration. So it's more plug and play. So people are pretty excited about that, and yeah, it's cool, and that gives you potentially full history as well if you want it. So that's nice, because at the one end of the spectrum, we have people arguing that computers are fast, networks are fast, we should go to gigablocks, like back in 2015, right? And
Yeah.
at the other end of the spectrum, you've got whole countries and continents with like very few nodes, and when you dig into why, it's because it's too expensive, right? What I think Nigeria has like very few nodes, for example, and like one of the guys with the nodes, we know who it is, right? It's like a Bitcoin contributor,
Yeah.
and so a very high speed internet connection there is like probably more than most people's salary or something, right? So it's just a different economic situation, and there are parts of the world where that's the case. So that's one of the interests for the satellite project, is to reduce the cost of directly participating in the network. And at the same time, we added the full sync. We recently added um, Lightning gossip data too. So the Lightning network, if you connect a Lightning node to a Lightning network, the biggest data consumption is catching up with the state of the network. So it's source routed. So each node needs to know a full map of reachable nodes, and then it gets updates over time. So we made a protocol to basically broadcast it over the satellite, and that means if you've got a fixed dish that's receiving Bitcoin data running a Bitcoin full node, receiving the Lightning gossip data running a Lightning node, now your external bandwidth usage drops another order of magnitude on a Lightning side as well. So you can do your own routing without relying on a third party, and your kind of internet bill and bandwidth use goes down a lot. So you can run it on, I don't know, like a 2G or 2.5G smartphone tether or something without running up a big bill in a market where data is expensive relative to the cost of living.
Yeah, that's very clever. So essentially, instead of that person having to download, call it 400 gigs of Bitcoin blockchain, plus maybe another gig or so of gossip Lightning data, then now they can download all that through the satellite dish, and then they would still need an outgoing internet connection, but as you were saying, they would need a lot less in terms of
Right.
external bandwidth, and that in doing so, it's making it more accessible for people who want to be able to be the, as we say, the fully sovereign Bitcoin and
Right.
Lightning user doing it in there with their own keys and their own Bitcoin node and all of that, all those good things that we like people to do.
Yep.
Um, yeah, so I think that's an interesting aspect there around censorship and how Bitcoin helps people participate even where they haven't been. And for some people, that's just using a simple mobile wallet, but for others, it's actually going the full way and using your own Bitcoin node. And of course, we encourage people to be able to do that, but we understand that not everyone can. Um, I'm also curious your view on development in the ecosystem. So we've seen that come a long way in the recent years. We see multiple development organizations. We're seeing Bitcoin exchanges and companies support Bitcoin development. And of course, I know Blockstream, you do support directly some Bitcoin and Lightning developers. What's your view on the current state of Bitcoin development funding? And is there anything you'd like to see in the future there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of maintenance aspect, if you like, is covered. So, in the sense that, I think the Bitcoin project is quite big in the kind of list of open source projects, the number of contributors, how active the project is. If you stack ranks GitHub things, it's pretty high up there. And so I think the area which is maybe more interesting to me is to see um, features that reach users, right? So if somebody's refactoring part of Bitcoin to make it more scalable or elegant or something, that's good and it needs to happen. But there's a group of people who are funded to do that now. But what is a little more tricky is, there's a new feature that comes into Bitcoin and it has implications, and people want to use it, and they need wallet support, or they need application support or web integration, and so historically, mostly the way those things happen is a startup, tackles a problem. But I think there'd be room for open source funding to build use cases. Like, so one thing we tried to help seed was um, more peer-to-peer coin join. Basically, some of the coin join protocols involve a server, and that's a policy risk potentially. And so conceptually, you would like that to happen in a wallet, purely in like a peer-to-peer wallet. So the wallets are somehow coordinating, and that's it. It's peer-to-peer. Then there's no server to shut down, and it's more resilient, and more people can use it. So we organized a kind of hackathon um, for people to come to a location or dial in and discuss, brainstorm about how to do that. And that was the pay join protocol, also called pay to endpoint. And so it's not a full join, but it's a kind of opportunistic join. So it proved to be relatively challenging, but this incremental bit of tech seemed promising, which is that you basically join with the merchant or the person you're paying, so they get to defragment their wallet a bit and save a bit of money, because reorganizing a wallet costs fees too with you, and it breaks some of the heuristics, because the changes, it looks like the person you're paying put one of the inputs into it, and so you don't really know what the amount was, and you can't tell it was a pay to endpoint or pay join. So I think things like that, so if you wallets implemented that, it's in a BTC Pay server integrated wallet, but it could use being available in more wallets. And so I think projects like that could use funding. where there's actually an end user reachable result, and hopefully interoperability is another issue, right? So I think it'd be nice to see more interoperability and things like that, and also some bigger, more ambitious projects, because the sort of maintenance and new BIPs is one side of work, but I mean, apart from Taproot, and some other Lightning developments, there are some bolder things that could be done, but perhaps not the teams of specialized people to push them forward. So I think that could be interesting.
So what kind of bolder things are you referring to? Like a new?
Well, I mean, like new layer twos focused on privacy or confidential transactions in Bitcoin. Let's because I mean, quite often people have an idea, but if nobody, the innovations come by trying. So if you just try to do it, I mean, not deploy it, but try to build it and see what it's like in a wallet and how it works. Sometimes the act of doing that um, results in an interesting discovery optimization. So I think, let's try and do some of these things. Um, I mean, of course, it's very curious because if you ask Bitcoin holders and investors what they care about, they mostly care about security and dependability. They'll say, well, I mean, sadly, some of them don't really care about Lightning that much either, right? And they're just saying, well, don't break it. Just don't break Bitcoin, cold storage security, and I'm happy. So they would actually be happy if it was like largely ossified, in fact. But I think that, that loses some potential. So I think the ossification. I mean, because there's another Satoshi quote about how he rushed the Bitcoin script um, so that it would be sort of self-extensible, so people could build other things with it without needing to change it, with the idea that it would be hard to change Bitcoin. So I think it's a very interesting observation because I'm not sure it would have been obvious to most of us that it would be hard to change Bitcoin at the beginning when it had no users, but evidently he saw that would be the case, and so he tried to make it extensible. But the Bitcoin script is not that expressive, so and some of it got disabled because of bugs, right? So I think something like Simplicity, which is another project we're working on at Blockstream that dates back to kind of early Bitcoin IRC, is next generation scripting for Bitcoin. So obviously that's also something that's a few years away, but for the Bitcoin, but it's coming to Liquid much more imminently. We just did another update and hope to have that in Liquid later this year. So if people get experience using that in Liquid, maybe that could come to Bitcoin and provide the extensibility. But obviously that requires a lot of interoperability work and wallet work over time.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so there's lots of different angles and ways that things could go. I'm curious then, in your mind, which is more important? Is the hard money, digital savings technology aspect, or is it the ability to use Bitcoin privately, or perhaps even like the smart scripting aspects? Which are, like for you,
Yeah.
how would you preference order those?
Well, I can. It's a very interesting question because you see some contention on this front already, right? So people who are focused on the digital gold aspect are some of them are not too concerned about uh, you know over-regulation, let's say. And so there is a future, a Bitcoin future, which sees Bitcoin as digital gold, maybe with too much of it in ETFs. And I think that's like potentially a policy risk for the permissionlessness. And so if you had to choose, I would actually choose the electronic cash, Bearer electronic cash case. But I think they're like interlinked. So if you push it too far and Bitcoin becomes, most of it is in ETF and ETF-like products. Like there's a lot of ETF-like products today, right? Where there's a custodian and you own units in something. Um, So if that percentage gets too high, I think it runs into policy risks and it could erode the value. So maybe it has value as a digital gold that's mostly as a as savings technology, but I think that loses the potential. And the reason many of us get excited about Bitcoin, which is the sort of permissionlessness of it all, right? That you've got an internet, global internet money that people can innovate on and use without permission. Um, so yeah, that's the discussion there.
Yeah.
So
So if
hopefully it can be both, right? But I think we have to be a bit careful about not having too much stuff in central custody.
I see. Yeah. So if you had a message for people out there who are maybe they are lawmakers and legislators on Bitcoin, what would you say to them about the aspects and the need for the censorship resistant elements of Bitcoin?
Well, I think it's a useful analogy to look at the internet because um, it took governments a while to adapt to the concept that that people could communicate and there wasn't much they could do about it. And that wasn't a bad thing. That was a good thing, right? It improved freedoms in the world, overthrew some corrupt governments ultimately, or as it was a part in that, right? People's ability to organize. And it just changed the balance of power, and that became the new norm. So, but that is largely down, I think, to the open network, permissionless nature of it. That people could innovate, where with previous network technologies, you'd have to be a telecom company, or nearer the sort of kind of overlapping period, like a mobile phone operator, when those were very locked down and it's hard to get third-party apps. So that world is a much less innovative world. It doesn't evolve and improve. And so I think the message is like open networks win. So you know don't over-regulate or try to take the permissionless nature out of it, or it will be bad for the golden goose. And it's a global world, so the business will move elsewhere. And you know, the fortunes of um, empires change over time, right? There were periods where different parts of the world were the center of the economic world, and there's room for that to change again. So take it easy on, you know, squeezing innovation out of your geography. Like the the currency, which is the world reserve currency, only lasts historically like 100 years or so. So, you can lose world reserve currency status, that'll be bad. You can lose the nexus of like blockchain innovation, that will also be bad as that becomes a bigger part of the global future. So, politicians ultimately just are public servants. They work for the public, and the public, you know, the progress of humanity is what matters, right? So I think regulators just have to be careful to not get in the way of that.
Excellent. Well, that's probably a good point to finish up here. So, listeners, make sure you follow Adam3US on Twitter, and Blockstream.com. Anywhere else you would like to point listeners to?
No, that's good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Adam. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise. Great catching up.